Okay, looks like we're recording. So thank you, Jonah, very much for joining with me today. Can I get you just to give, I guess, a very quick intro to yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name's Jonah. I'm just, I'm professionally I'm a math teacher, but I also have a background in philosophy, and I'm really interested in a lot of different questions in philosophy, including philosophy of mind and this sort of topic. So I'm always happy to just talk with people about it and the positions I hold. But nothing too exciting. Just kind of in my day-to-day life, I'm a math teacher, but just do this kind of in my spare time, just because I find it interesting.
Likewise, I can resonate with, apart from I'm not a math teacher. So yeah, I'm Dan. I am not an academic philosopher, but I very much do it as a hobby. I work professionally as a web designer, and I write a blog called Doubtology. So I kind of do that as and when. And yeah, I guess I've been into philosophy for kind of like 6 or 7 years now. I think I actually got into philosophy after sort of deconverting from Christianity. So that's kind of, yeah, how I winded up thinking existentially, I guess. Yeah, okay, right. I've got a couple of preliminary questions. And yeah, I guess I wanted to ask you, Jonah, how you got into the philosophy of mind.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, like you, I come from a Christian background, and sort of when I left the faith, when I was much younger, I was like 17, whatever years old or whatever. But it definitely was one of those things where when you sort of give up a worldview like that, you sort of have to rebuild one, right? Like I'm like, oh, all of these things I just assumed about the mind, about ethics, about causality, all this other stuff just kind of goes out the window. So you have to restart or whatever. And so, for a long time, I got in, really more into like ethics and things like that. And I got into philosophy of religion itself a lot. But then maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, actually through stuff about philosophy of religion and obviously there you start hearing people talk a lot about debates around consciousness and theory of mind, because you get things about whether there are souls and what makes a human person and all of that. And so that's really how I came to it, is getting interested in the philosophy of personhood. I also do a lot of work along with my wife on the philosophy of abortion. And so that was another area where, a lot of it actually came from my wife being like, hey, I'm reading more of these papers on, things like perception, personhood, consciousness, things like that in that context. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, oh, a lot of this is playing on these other things that I'm reading in philosophy of religion. And like, I should stop tangentially exploring this concept, right? And actually be like, what do I think about philosophy of mind? Because before that, I had always been a sort of vague, like everyone, like a physicalist, but I didn't really think too hard about it. I sort of had those like same dualist intuitions, and I, didn't really care that much about it, but I kind of came to it from both sides. And like, these two other issues I care much more about are kind of hitting up on this. And so I'm going to look into it. And then when I did, I just found it fascinating. And almost immediately I had my brief period of checking out a lot of views, but almost immediately I got really into the views that I'm holding now. And I've been just kind of exploring them kind of off and on since then.
Nice. Yeah, I think ethics was also kind of my gateway drug.
Yeah.
It's one of those areas where I guess you have kind of intuitions, and I find that it's kind of like one that you kind of get engaged with pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Unlike, I found, I think with philosophy of mind, that's been sort of less the case. There's just a lot of technical stuff going on.
Sure.
So I think it took me a while to kind of build up to it. But it was, for similar reasons, I think one of those things that I've always kind of wanted to get to the bottom of. I likewise was broadly a physicalist, and then kind of realized that when I sort of began to flesh that out, I looked more like a dualist than I guess I initially thought. And then over time, my thoughts have evolved quite a bit. I'd now, if I had to pick a side, it would kind of be idealism. And I'm kind of interested in the extent to which idealism and physicalism can be kind of made consistent. Like, there's an obvious sense in which they can't, depending on how we think about the physical. But I think there's a pretty interesting way that they kind of can be kind of reconciled. But then saying that, because it it's quite a radical move to kind of go whole hog and become an idealist. I have this sort of like this kind of background niggle of like, okay, have I just made like a mistake somewhere along the way? So I find that right now I'm kind of backpedaling a little bit on retracing some of my steps and trying to get a bit of a sense of, okay, is there kind of like a bit more of a workable, more like a standard kind of physicalism that I can recover? And I guess the jury's out on that as well. Maybe you'll help me.
Yeah, I'm gonna try my best.
yeah, let's do it. Cool. And so the next question was, is there a view that you'd particularly kind of commit to? Like, would you sort of identify as an illusionist?
Yeah, I would say I am an illusion. I mean, I would say that I am above all a physicalist, right? Like I am very, very strongly convinced of that. I agree with what you're saying too, that there are sort of like monistic interpretations of physicalism that are sort of like isomorphic with idealism, right? Like at some point there's not the same, it's almost like that horseshoe theory, right? Thing of like, if you're saying there's only one thing and everything is that or whatever, then whether that is a physical or mental, in some ways there's not as much of a distinction between those points as the other points on the horseshoe or whatever. So, but I would say for me, I'm very strongly a physicalist, very, very convinced of that. So a lot of, a lot of times people accuse illusionists. They'll say like, well, you're just destined to be a physicalist. And you're just doing whatever you can to remain a physicalist. And I'm like, guilty as charged. Like, I do think that the strength of illusionism is it's a way of making a physicalist account of consciousness coherent in a way that a lot of other more reductive accounts I don't think are functional, right? So I think that would definitely be my position. I definitely am very convinced as a physicalist, and I think illusionism is the best physicalist account of consciousness for sure. Although it is a very young position, right? And obviously I think that, I think it's only going to get stronger as more people do more work on it. But obviously it is up in the air such that when you say, I'm an illusionist, you're not really having to devote yourself to like a huge body of thought in the same way if you said like I'm a dualist. You've got this like hundreds of years and thousands of years of kind of stuff to build on. But illusionism is not totally out of nowhere. It has precedence, but it's definitely a younger idea. So it's a little, by its very nature, it's going to be a little bit of a looser thing. But so far as it is like a constellation of views right now, I definitely think that's where I am.
Yeah, it'd be really fascinating to kind of explore some of that, because I think I've definitely I started off kind of having those intuitions like this can't be right, like no, something's gone wrong here, and I think I kind of didn't take the view seriously for quite a while, but I've got to the point where I'm like, okay, now I can see like the merit here, but I think there are still some areas that I'd have to work out, but like so I'm kind of interested to see to what extent it's illusionism's kind of on the table for me, I guess. So,
yeah, because that's the one thing I'd say, right, is like I don't necessarily ever want to like convince people of illusionism, but I do want them to think it's not crazy, because a lot of people think illusionism is just insane, right? Like there are a lot of people say it's like I think Galen Strawson says the least plausible position you could ever have in actually, no hyperbole, the least plausible position ever. And I'm like, I just want people to know that's not true, right? So I just want to get people to like, it's one idea among many and not just like this totally crazy idea,
Yeah, and I think we'll get to some of this, because I think it depends to some extent where illusionism enters the dialectic, because I think if it enters where I think many people think it does, then maybe it is crazy. Maybe it's not. Like, I don't know. Like, I guess I'd want to kind of. We'll get to that.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, right. Let's start from the top of these ones then. So, is there a hard problem of consciousness? And then I've kind of put in parentheses there. If so, whose problem? Because that's kind of almost a secondary question to that.
For sure. My answer to that would be yes. I do think there is. Now, whether, so obviously, for people who aren't aware, right, the hard problem of consciousness is supposed to be, there are all these sort of easy problems about just general, neurological processing and the relations between different mental states and all that stuff that kind of everybody can sort of work on. But there's this supposedly this kind of big irreconcilable problem at the center of like, how do our perceptual states, our phenomenal states fit into our broader picture of of the world, right? Because most people have this kind of intuitive sense that like there's a difference between like what you see and the thing you're seeing. You know, there's kind of a, you know, most people would say like, yeah, I have this kind of these experiences that have these qualities, this like what its likeness to them that like a table doesn't have, right? Like a you know, this desk I'm at right now, there's nothing it's like to be that desk, but there's something it's like to be me. So it feels like my consciousness is this subjective first person thing that's just different from physical objects. So how could my consciousness just be a set of brain states or whatever, you know? And I do think there's a real problem there in the sense that that is like, of course that's a problem, right? It's a problem just because enough people think it's a problem, right? In the sense that if enough people have this intuitive sense that consciousness can't be physical, then it's a problem to figure out how it might be. But I don't think it's an irreconcilable problem. And I think it's a problem that gets softer or easier as we chip away at the edges, right? I think that, you know, to maybe put it another way, I think 100 years ago, it was a harder problem, right? And with advances in neuroscience and advances in general conceptual analysis, it's become an easier problem, but it is still a problem for sure. And I think there are some people who are too glib and they say, oh, it's not that weird, don't worry about it. And I think that is wrong. I think it is definitely like an issue that does need to be addressed, even if I don't think it's this fundamental, you know, roadblock that will never be dealt with.
Yeah, got you. I think I've heard people kind of speak about this in different ways. So, for example, some people will say, well, there is no hard problem because I'm an illusionist and therefore there's no hard problem, or I'm an idealist and therefore there's no hard problem, and the hard problem is for those physicalists over there, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
That's definitely one way I've heard it sort of spoken about. But yeah, at the same time, I think, yeah, it depends how we're answering this question. So I think my answer would be, to the extent that I'm an idealist and idealism is true, then perhaps there is no hard problem of consciousness. There's just a bit of a puzzle there, but it all kind of checks out, and maybe it's even kind of a priori, kind of the whole way through, kind of thing. But then at the same time, perhaps there's a different way of thinking about this, where we all have the hard problem and we're all just kind of answering it in different ways, kind of thing. But yeah, it depends how people are using this phrase, the hard problem.
Yeah.
I guess I'm thinking of people who perhaps Philip Goff is like this, where he might kind of say that there is an in principle problem, but that's specifically for physicalism, and then perhaps you have to like make some different moves if you don't want that problem. But I mean,
Yeah.
would you sort of agree with any of this, or do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that everyone's going to have a sort of different. Like I agree with you that what we talk about as the hard problem is almost all for physicalists, right? Like
yeah,
anybody who brings up the term the hard problem, they're talking about how a physicalist can pull it off. But I think that it's also the case that everyone is going to have some hard problem, right? Like obviously, if there was a theory of consciousness that did not have some big asterisk on it where people are like, wait, hold on, that doesn't make sense, then everyone would have that theory, right? So, you know, I would say, you know, there's the hard problem is maybe specific for physicalism, but everyone is going to have some. I mean, if you're an idealist, you have this hard problem of why it seems like some things are not mental and other things are, right? Or if you're a dualist, you have this hard problem of explaining, you know, how to differentiate between the two, how they're related, you know, blah, 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 right? So I think rhetorically physicalists are maybe in like the worst position to have like a hard problem. But, you know, I think it's important to remember there's no view where everyone's like, okay, that makes perfect sense. Because if there was, everyone would have that view.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess I've flirted with the idea that perhaps idealism is that magical view, but but I mean, I guess I've never quite worked out exactly what the big problem would be with idealism. It's more just the wrong way around. Like, it just feels like we got reality inside out, and that's a bit of a problem. But like, if we can reorder our thoughts and make it work, then that's fine. But I mean, it's worth just asking you, I guess, like, is there I don't know, do you see any kind of insurmountable problems for idealism?
I do, sadly, because I mean, as we go, I think what you're going to see is that my conception of how the mental works basically rules out idealism kind of from the start. Because I would say that a lot of the, when an idealist says, I think everything is mental in this way, I'm going to come back and say, actually, I think that like the quality you're talking about that you're extending to everything doesn't exist at all, right? So I would say that,
Right.
like, I don't deny the existence of the mental properly understood, but I would say like the sort of mentality that that an idealist says everything is, I would say actually nothing is like that, right? So in the same way though that an idealist might say, the sort of physicality that a physicalist thinks a table has, nothing is like that, right? So it's not necessarily that there's an insurmountable internal problem with idealism. It's that I think idealism is not like in contact with the reality of our own mentation, right? So like maybe another way to put it would be, there's like a possible universe or something, right, where everything is everything is mental, and it's like that universe makes sense, there's nothing wrong with it, but the way that world is not the way that our mentation actually is, right? And so it's almost like maybe like the problem of evil in philosophy of religion, right? It's like you could have a god living in a perfect wonderful world, and I wouldn't say there was an internal problem with like that perfect heavenly realm. But when I look at our world and I see the way things actually are, I'm like, that doesn't work with this. And in the same way, I would say, you could talk about in a world that is idealist, and I don't think there's inherently anything logically contradictory about it. But that's the world we have does not have those properties. That's the way I would put it. And I think as we get in further talking about illusionism, we'll see what I'm saying there. That probably seems like a somewhat vague statement, but that is what I would say is, yes, I do think idealism does not end up working for the actual data we have about our own mentation when it's properly understood.
Got you. Yeah, I guess I'll try and keep us a bit more on scope, and maybe that's one for another day. But that would be an interesting conversation in its own right, I think. But okay, so yeah, we've spoken about the hard problem. So we've got the next one. Does your average person think that of their experiences in terms of phenomenal properties?
Yeah, and so maybe before I get into that, I'm going to talk about what a phenomenal property is, right? So I don't know the level of anyone who would ever listen to this, but also just to clarify our terms, right? So when people talk about phenomenal properties, right, they're talking about this idea that a lot of people have this kind of pre-theoretical, intuitive sense. And I'm actually going to quote Keith Frankish here, is a very important illusionist, right? Because it's a great description of what kind of a lot of people think when they think of phenomenal properties, right? And so this is him, this is not his view, right? Because he's an illusionist, but this is him giving an account of what phenomenal realism would be, right? And so it goes like this. Experiences possess introspectable mental properties corresponding to the perceptible properties of things in the world. The experience of seeing something yellow has a mental yellow property. The experience of smelling coffee has a mental coffee smell property. The experience of pain in one's toe has a mental toe pain property, and so on. The mental properties are phenomenal properties. They can constitute the subjective feel of the experience, what it's like to see yellow, smell coffee, feel pain in your toe, and so on. And they supply something that's missing from the non-mental world, right? So phenomenal properties are described sometimes as the intrinsic features of experience, which are at least conceptually distinct from functional and representational ones. And then that's the end of that quote. But later on, he talks about a great metaphor from Bloch is like the idea of paint, right? Like you can paint a picture and there's whatever's in the picture, but then also the paint has some quality apart from what it represents, right? So if I paint a portrait of you or whatever, and I use some green paint for your shirt, that green paint will represent your shirt, but it also has an inherent quality apart from what it represents. It has its own texture and consistency and color and all that. And so you can think of phenomenal properties sort of being like that for our experiences. So that is something where a lot of people, if you ask them, to get back to the question, like, does your average person think that? They'll say yes, right? Like if you ask the average person, like, hey, is there something it's like to to see a red rose? Like, is there such a thing as the redness of what you're seeing? You know, if you kind of speak in those kind of folk theoretical terms, I think most people will say yes, but I also think most people will agree with more illusionist things where you instead, or at least not even necessarily illusionist, but more less explicitly phenomenally realist things where if you just say like, hey, you know, is there, instead of saying it's a property of your experience, is it maybe just a property of the object, right? So, you know, if you go to someone and you show them a banana and you say, hey, is there a mental yellowness that you see when you look at this banana? Are you coming in contact with a mental yellowness? They'll probably say yes. But if you also go up to them and say, hey, are you seeing that this banana is yellow? They'll also say yes, right? So I think that most people do have kind of a default dualism or a sort of default, you know, sense of phenomenal realism, but I don't think it's like a robust one. I think it's one that's easy to short circuit and is more a linguistic convention than anything else. But I do think that it's there. Like, obviously, even a lot of philosophers will say, yeah, I feel this way. You know, I have these thoughts. So, yes, I do think people think that way, but I think it's a loose one that is more linguistic and cultural than like representing like a firm considered position in the same way that maybe some other beliefs would be.
Yeah. This I find this. I mean, I struggle to answer this question. I can only kind of speak of my own experience, and I think there was a moment before I got into learning about the philosophy of mind where I just didn't see, like, I don't think I'd have had any intuitions in favor of phenomenal properties and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Then there was that kind of moment where someone sort of brings that sort of the problem to life about the sort of what its likeness and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I think ever since that point, I've been a convert and I've been finding it hard to shake. So yeah. But I'm also thinking of people like Lance Bush and sort of work that he's doing where he's kind of exploring where the extent to which people's intuitions or like naive or like non sort of philosophically trained people have these kind of intuitions, and it sounds kind of like the jury's out kind of thing. So yeah, it's a hard one to answer.
I think it's really a situation where it's technical enough and philosophically theoretically laden enough that most people probably don't have a fully worked out view in the same way they probably don't have like a fully worked out meta ethical view or whatever, right? And so I think, like you said, in some ways I do think that like phenomenal realism is like a mind virus where like you hear it, and if that's your first way of interpreting your thoughts, it fits really well and it can be hard to shake. But I would imagine, you know, I don't know, but you know, if you had an illusionist culture where everyone grew up thinking about it in different ways, it would maybe be hard for them to shift and think differently, you know? And there are also illusionists who believe that, like you said, that the kind of Cartesian self and all that is like literally this sort of culturally constructed thing that maybe other cultures don't have and that we just can't escape. Some people think it's a product of language, right? So, you know, there are all sorts of kind of empirical questions about how meaningful these categories are to the random person, and whether that random person would be different if they were in a different culture or time period or all that. So it's difficult to it's difficult to answer that easily. But certainly there are a lot of people who are hostile to illusionism when they hear it. So certainly it is not immediately intuitive in the same way, maybe.
Yeah, sure. And can I ask, like, do you feel like you're like biting a bullet, so to speak, when you go in for illusionism? Like, is it the case that you kind of lack that intuition that all the dualists and non-physicalists have?
That's a great question. And I would say no, right? I don't think that illusionism requires biting any bullets. And so that's maybe one thing where, let me lay out just really quickly what illusionism is actually saying, because I think a lot of people misunderstand the actual claim being made, right? Which is, a lot of people think that illusionism is this sort of radical rejection of common sense, right? And it's like a totally revolutionary view that is saying that we sort of have to totally revise our common sense conception of experience. But illusionism is specifically saying that our common sense of experience is is like correct in the sense of that is what it seems like to us, right? So a lot of people will say like, well, how could illusionism be true? It really feels like there are all these phenomenal properties, but that's not in contradiction with illusionism. In fact, part of illusionism is the view that it really does seem as though things have phenomenal properties. And so, you know, if you look at illusionism as basically being these two sort of premises, right? The first is that there are no phenomenal properties. But the second is that it seems as though there are, right? If you want in one sentence, illusionism is the idea that phenomenality is an introspective illusion, right? It appears that way, but it's not. And so when people say like, oh, you have to really bite this bullet, there's no real bullet to bite here, because you're allowed to say, and not only allowed to, but like required, so to speak, to say my experiences, the way they seem to me is like the way they seem to me. I'm not like, I'm not wrong in a meaningful sense. It's not reflecting reality in a correct way, but why should I expect my internal representations to reflect reality in that way? A great metaphor that I'll give, and then I'll move on, but a really good metaphor, you know, the name illusionism is so good because 90% of the time you can clarify things by just talking about a real life illusion, right? So think about like a classic magic trick where some, you know, the magician, you know, saws a woman in half and then pulls the things apart and it looks like she's been cut in half, and then he puts it back together and she comes out all healthy, right? You've seen that classic trick, right? So illusionism would, you know, if you had an illusionist perspective on that, you would say it really looked like that woman got cut in half. But actually, that's because it was being shown to you in a very specific perspective, in a very specific way that was designed to mislead you. And so if you were, you know, an illusionist about that magic trick and you said, hey, I think it's actually fake, you know, she didn't really get cut in half, it wouldn't be a meaningful response for someone in the audience to say, oh, but it really seemed like she got cut in half. You would say, yeah, that's the whole point, right? Like, I'm not arguing that you're an idiot and that you got, you know, he was doing something totally different and you got confused and thought the woman got cut in half. It's not a hallucination, right? It's like, it's meant to look that way. And so everything's going right when you see it that way, but it's just not reflecting reality. And so I would say like, people who think illusionism requires this really big bullet bite at the start where you just have to take this totally implausible perspective, the only thing you have to take that might be implausible is the idea that your introspection is not always accurate. But and so that's the thing that needs to be debated, is like, why should we believe that introspection on our own phenomenal states would accurately represent the world? That's the difficult thing. But once you move beyond that, just the mere fact that things appear phenomenal is not a difficulty for illusionism. And in some sense, illusionism, that's an important part of illusionism, right? Is that it should appear to you like things are phenomenal, right? So no, I think that I think illusionism directly accounts for our common sense experiences. It doesn't require that we reject them. It requires that we not extrapolate from them in ways that are unjustified.
I'll come back with the sort of classic response. Not saying this is a good response.
No,
but,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So, and let me use a different example. So let's use like a mirage in the desert.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm there in the desert and I can see this, what looks to me like a body of water over there. It turns out there's no body of water at all. So the thing kind of outside of my head, the thing I thought was outside of my head over there, that's not there. That was an illusion. But then there's this other sense in which the seeming that it seemed to me that there was a mirage over there. That was sort of almost undeniable. And so how can the seeming itself be subject to the illusion?
Yeah, that is definitely what people would come back with, right? And so I would say there are a few things to say. So one, I would say that a mirage, we have to be careful, is not technically an illusion, it's a hallucination, right? Because an illusion would be when something is being represented in a way that is misleading, whereas like a hallucination is something that doesn't even exist at all as being represented, right? And the only reason that matters, right, is because we have a sort of evolutionary story for why our minds might want to misrepresent things. We don't have an evolutionary story for why they might, except in very maybe narrow circumstances, might just want to make us see things that are totally random, right? Like even in a mirage, you know, that's a physical phenomenon, right? Having to do with light being reflected and all of that. But again, the question is, you're totally correct, right? That people have this intuition where they're like, well, I'm seeing something, and the thing I'm seeing doesn't exist out there in the world. So therefore, there must be something in my head that I'm seeing instead, right? But Gilbert Harman, who's a great philosopher, has a point that he makes about this with a you might not get this reference because you're not American, but Ponce de Leon, right, was this like Spanish guy who was looking for the fountain of youth in like the 1500s, right? And he went through this Southern America and Florida looking for the fountain of youth, right? And you can ask yourself, like, what did he want to find? Is he wanted the fountain of youth, right? But does the fountain of youth exist? No, hopefully you'd agree with me on that one, right? But that doesn't mean that he wanted an idea, right? Even though Ponce de Leon wanted something that doesn't exist, that doesn't mean he wanted an idea in his head, right? Ponce de Leon was not going through the forest looking for an idea in his head. He was looking for a real physical thing called the fountain of youth. It just didn't exist, right? And so when we talk about things like desires, we don't fall into that trap of thinking because it doesn't exist out there, instead I must want something mental, right? We're capable of saying, no, you want something physical. It's just the thing you want doesn't exist. And so I would say the same thing about a mirage. I would say, or some any sort of illusion, right? Like what you're seeing is this beautiful oasis, right? It's just that what you're seeing doesn't exist. And so it's a mistake in my mind to say, well, therefore I must be seeing something mental. I think that when, let's say you're in the desert and weirdly enough, there is an actual oasis, and then you turn 90 degrees and then you also see a mirage of an oasis, right? I think you're seeing the same thing in both cases. In both cases, you are seeing an oasis. The difference is that in one sense, your mental representations are accurate, right? So you are acquainted with an oasis that actually exists. And in the other situation, your mental representations are inaccurate. So you're acquainted with an oasis that doesn't exist. But there's no reason that the existence of something out there or non-existence of something out there should change what's going on in your head. Like that's one of the big things that converted me actually to hard representationalism and to illusionism is this idea of like what's going on in my head should not change just based on what's going on outside, right? Like I want an account of perception that is kind of applicable in all these cases. And it doesn't have like the rules don't magically change depending on whether or not my perceptions are accurate. Because that to me was a big issue with like a lot of other forms of realism, right? Is that they kind of commit you to this idea that magically the rules for what constitutes knowledge or constitutes perception change depending on this external factor of whether or not something's out there or not. And that is tough for me to buy. So to get back to your original point, sorry, I agree with you that it does seem like, well, if I see this oasis, there is no oasis. So what am I seeing? But what I would say is that you're seeing an oasis. Your mind is representing an oasis. It's just that the oasis you're seeing doesn't exist. And I think that fits well with our common sense linguistic ordinary language, right? People say all the time, like, oh man, I saw something that wasn't really there, right? Or like, oh man, I saw a pink elephant that doesn't exist. People talk that way. People don't usually say like, oh yeah, I got really drunk last night and I encountered a mental image of a pink elephant, right? They say I saw a pink elephant, right? And I think that it's really good when a theory of perception can accommodate that without having to kind of redefine that way of speaking.
Right. Okay. I want to backpedal to my example. So I used that thinking that the mirage in the desert is an illusion, and I guess I was thinking in terms of there's some content or other that I'm aware of, that I'm consciously aware of, and that is representing, or at least I perceive it or take it to be representing an oasis. And so that, what am I trying to say here? I guess I'm thinking in terms of there's something representational going on, but I guess I'm thinking of that in terms of like kind of more of a narrow content than a broad content. So yeah, I'm wondering. Yes, I think that this kind of gets much more complex because we've got sort of properties going on outside of the head, properties going on inside of the head, and it's almost sometimes hard to keep track of like all of those aspects. So would you disagree that that I am actually representing that I'm representing a body of water in the desert? Like, would you say
No,
that?
I would agree with that. I think you are representing a body of water in the desert for sure. Your mind is representing that to you for sure.
So for that to be accurate, there would have to be a body of water over there that corresponds to it, but there's not. So I was taking that to be an illusion, but you said it was a hallucination. So
well, because the distinction I want to make, right, is that, like, you know, obviously our minds are not agential in the sense that no one, you know, I guess unless you're a theist or whatever, but if you're a naturalist, no one designed your brain to think this way. So I don't want to speak too much in terms of like intention. But when I say illusion, I think it's important to point out that, like, to be an illusionist is to think there's sort of a reason your mind is doing this, right? And that it's sort of something your brain is actually doing, as opposed to just for a reason, in the sense that it's evolutionarily advantageous to represent things to you this way, and it's not just sort of like a malfunction, right? And I think the reason that matters is because when you have that, again, not purpose, but speaking broadly of, you know, the purpose of any evolutionary adaptation, right? It makes it easier to account for why it happens, right? It's not just things go crazy and randomly for some reason you feel like you have phenomenal experiences. It's that there are specific reasons why you might have these experiences, right? And so that doesn't change the bedrock of it, but it's just important to point out that, like, you know, when you look at just a random, like I guess I don't know the science about mirages, but I guess I thought that a mirage was an actual physical, like the light is bouncing off the hot air or something. I don't know, right? But yeah, something like that, right? So in that case, yeah, I would just say that you know, in that case, it's difficult because I would say maybe you are actually representing it correctly, but what you're representing correctly is like light being refracted in a weird way or something like that, right? You know, but maybe a better example would be like you're in the wilderness and you see the oasis, and it's like some actual inborn psychological thing drives you to think it's, you know, more glistening and beautiful than it really is, because your brain's trying to get you to go drink water or something like that, right? But I do agree with you that yes, it is representing that to you, right? Even if it was a hallucination, it would be representing that to you.
Okay, got you. Should we move on to Qualia?
Yeah, for sure, because that's I think where
I think there's
where the conflict starts.
Yeah, there's some stuff that I think it would be good to get in order, so before we kind of get onto the more of the stuff around like representationalism and that kind of thing. So I guess I can begin by kind of saying what I think Qualia is, or are, sorry. So Qualia are, I mean, I use the term sort of broadly in the same way that I talk about phenomenal properties or phenomenal character, or that kind of thing. They're the sort of qualitative character of experience, or what we sometimes call the what it's likeness. That's how I tend to use the term. Is that kind of roughly how you would use it?
I do think qualia and phenomenal properties should generally be considered interchangeable, or at least that qualia is like a souped up version of, it's like phenomenal properties that also have some other features, right? So qualia I think is stronger than phenomenal properties, but there aren't that many people who would be like, yeah, I believe in phenomenal properties, but not qualia. Like most people who believe in phenomenal properties also give them the features that define qualia. So, you know, I'm happy to talk about either one. But I think most people, when they talk about phenomenal properties, they have in mind things that fit the broader definition of qualia that has all these other added extra bits that make it even more robust.
Yeah. And I think we'll get to that now. I was going to ask you, I mean, when people use the term like what it's likeness, do you like, some people are just like, what on earth do you mean? Like what even is that? Like, give me a more concrete definition, because that sounds like it's something that could be meaningless. Like, do you have those kind of worries, or are you quite happy with that that sort of
yes,
locution?
I do have those worries. I mean, this is the radical thing I'm going to say that a lot of people do here and they think is crazy. So I get this is why people don't like illusionism. But I would say I don't think there is anything it is like to be anyone or anything, right? Like what its likeness in that sense, I do totally dispute is like a real property, right? Now, people hear that and they think that's insane. And I get why they think that's insane, because they're interpreting it as like a very strong rejection of all consciousness. But what I would, to clarify, I believe there's something that, to pick an object, right? Like, I have this container of earplugs for my screaming baby, right? When I'm holding her and I don't want to go deaf, right? So like if I look at this, I would say there is something this is like to me, right? So if I say, this is white to me, right? This is, very light to me, right? This, makes a clicking sound to me, right? So there's something this object is like to me, but there's nothing it is like for me to see this object, right? And I think that any attempt to say what it's like to be me looking at this or whatever actually just reduces to a description of this, right? Like if someone says like, well, there, the what it's likeness of me looking at this is that there's like a whiteness, right? There's a white property to what it's like to see it, I think is a tortured way of saying that the object is white, right? And so I would say that what people are trying to express when they say, what it's like to be blank, I totally agree that there's something they're trying to express there that's correct, but I think that is conceptually a flawed way of understanding it, because I think that every account of what it's like to be X is actually an account of what something else is like to X. And if you try and ask what it's like to be X apart from anything else, I don't think there's anything there, right? I don't think there's anything just called consciousness. There's only consciousness of things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can't tell if I agree or disagree. I mean, I think I broadly agree with you. I think there's an extra nuance that I want to make sure that I don't kind of leave out, and that's like, I guess if there's two people observing the same thing, let's just say it's like an apple that's like partially red, partially green. Now somebody with like normal, whatever that means, normal sight, the normal sort of light cones and the who are able to pick up the differences between those colors. I mean, the apple's the same, right? But between a person who's red-green colorblind and a person who's not, there will be some qualitative difference between those two experiences. And I guess all I would want to do is make sure that I'm allowing for the mode. I think what I want to call like the mode of perception, or like the way that I'm perceiving might be different to the way that that person's perceiving.
And I think that's essential, right? Any theory of perception that doesn't accept that would be obviously false, for sure. I totally agree with that. But I would just say that the apple to the red-green, somebody who's red-green colorblind, I guess they'd see it just as one color, right? Would they see it as just red or just green? I don't remember, right? But let's say they see it as they're totally colorblind, see it's gray or whatever, right? Then I would say the apple is gray to them, right? And I would say the other person, the apple is green and red to them, right? And so rather than saying what it's like to be the colorblind person is that nothing has color, I would say to the colorblind person, nothing has color. But the quality of being colorless is a quality of the things that are being represented to the colorblind person, not a quality of the colorblind person's experience, right? So I wouldn't say it's like the colorblind person doesn't have the experiences of the non-colorblind person, but then those experiences have their color drained out. I would say they have an experience of a colorless apple or a gray apple or whatever, their sight represents, right? And maybe that's just totally linguistic. I don't know. But I think sometimes people read into the idea of what its likeness and give it real metaphorical or real like metaphysical weight that can be misleading.
And I think that so if I understand correctly, the point that Harman makes is that there's no extra properties that you're having when you're having the experience of the apple, for example. It's not that the apple is or that your experience has certain properties. It's that the apple itself has those properties.
Right. Yes. So like the apple is being represented as having certain color properties, but it is not your experience that has certain color properties, right? So you would say you're not having a red experience, you're having an experience of redness. And in his paper, he makes a great point about like imagine you have like a painting of a unicorn, right? He's like, you can talk about the painting of the subject, right? And so you'd say the painting is, it's on canvas, it's with paint, it's, so-and-so style or whatever, right? And then you can talk about the subject of the painting. You say it's a unicorn, it's got 4 legs, it's got a horn or whatever. And those aren't the same thing, right? So there's a difference between your experience of an object and the object of your experience. But people very easily conflate those. Even just in normal life, they conflate those, right? So, and so we would say that when you look at an apple, right? We would say the subject of your experience is red, but we wouldn't say that the redness of the experience of the subject is red, right? Like your experience isn't red. It's the object you are experiencing is red. It's being represented to you as red, but there's no internal mental redness that you're coming in contact with.
Yeah, because I think I want to agree with Harmon on that point, but I still think there's some mental redness going on. Maybe I think let's kind of push on, and maybe this point might come back up. So I wanted to kind of distinguish between, I guess, a few different things that we might mean when we talk about qualia. And so I guess in prep for this, I was kind of just reading through the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on qualia. And it kind of gives, there's 4 different sort of characterizations that it gives. So in a nutshell, like the first one is kind of like just to identify it with phenomenal character. They are the same thing. And I think this is like this is like the thing. If there's one thing I have in my mind, this is kind of the way that I use qualia. You can then sort of build on top of that some other things, and it might be that I do end up building some other things in. But as far as kind of saying, like, I guess what I'm getting at here is that can we all agree on that, and then can an illusionist even in that sense would an illusionist not say that like, for example, phenomenal character can be explained purely by virtue of sort of representational properties, and therefore that they actually exist as opposed to not existing?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Because there are some people who might say, well, even as an illusionist, you should believe there are phenomenal properties, but those, or qualia or whatever, but those phenomenal properties, what you're actually talking about are just these representational ones that kind of like appear phenomenal, right? At some point, I do think that would just be a linguistic dispute unless you double down on talking about what qualities they should have, right? Because like we're talking about the qualities, on that list, the big one that you get, for example, right, is people talk about like, qualia being immediately apprehendable, right? Like you can't be wrong about what you're feeling, right? And so like that would be something where that is not a linguistic dispute. I think an illusionist would have to say, no, phenomenal properties or quasi-phenomenal properties, wherever, do not have that, right?
Yeah,
feature, right? You can be wrong about what you're experiencing, right? And so like I think that would be something where like if that is part of your definition of qualia, then it is no longer a linguistic dispute. An illusionist would have to deny that, right? Or if you say that they're like, they're totally private, right? That there's this like kind of impassable gap between your subjective experience in the outside world. I think an illusionist would have to deny that as well, right? So that would be another example of like, if you really pared down the concept of qualia to just sort of phenomenality, and then the illusionist could say, well, okay, that phenomenality is actually just an illusion, but the thing that makes you feel that way, we're going to call that phenomenality, right? Like, I guess I can see that being a linguistic shift, but there are concrete things you would have to give up to do that, right? So I think most people who believe in qualia would not be comfortable doing that.
Yeah, okay. And so, yeah, so some of the other definitions, the second version was kind of like saying that qualia are properties of sense data. Obviously, to go in for that one, you're going to have to affirm sense data. So we can probably just scratch that off the table.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I definitely.
I'm kind of sympathetic to sense data on some days, but as a whole thing. So yeah, for the purposes of this, I definitely don't want to commit myself to that. Okay, the third one was intrinsic qualia as intrinsic non-representational properties, and I guess this is where kind of once we get into the subject of representationalism, this is where I guess qualia are sort of an alternative to the representational properties. So in that sense, perhaps you want, like an illusionist could say, well, the representational properties exist, but not these beefed up qualia that are non-representational, intrinsic kind of thing.
Exactly. Yes.
And then the fourth one being, I guess, I mean, it's kind of the one that I associate with Dennett, which is kind of intrinsic, non-physical, ineffable kind of thing.
Exactly.
Which, to be fair, I think some dualists would go in for that sort of that kind of view. And so I'm kind of scratching the sense data one off the table. I think we can kind of see these as like the lower grade version as kind of some sort of like weak. I don't want to sort of introduce extra like jargon and stuff, but just in terms of how I'm thinking of this, is sort of like weak qualia, and then some sort of like medium grade where when you get to the sort of non-representational stuff, and then some sort of like some sort of strong or heavyweight kind of qualia by the time you get up to that sort of specifically non-physical type thing. And so I think we can probably leave that like heavyweight stuff off the table. But what I wanted to do is just sort of surface these, because what by the time we get to talking about kind of representationalism, I want to hold that nuance between the weaker commitment and then the stronger commitment, because I think, if anything, I have that weaker commitment kind of for sure. That would be kind of a hard one to talk me out of. I'm flexible to some extent on that medium commitment of like, when we're talking about representationalism, can I go whole hog and be a strong representationalist, or like typically I'm probably more of a qualia theorist in the medium weight sense,
because there are accounts like what you call weak representationalism that sort of that, like, in some ways qualia is a good fit for, right? Because you have this sort of weak representationalism where you just say like, your brain is just making a movie in your head and you're watching the movie, and that movie is the representation, and you're in contact with the representation, and like that doesn't necessarily struggle with qualia at all, right? So I think you could do that, but that's also not the type of representationalism that I support, right? I think illusionism requires a much harder, a much stronger form of representationalism, and I think when you do that, it becomes hard to work qualia back in, because we don't have to. Let me pop back here because, let me just say real quick about this, because the thing is, it's important to remember that, like, with illusionism, with representationalism, the idea is like not that we are, at least for my type of representationalism, right? The idea is not that we are acquainted with the representation, but that the representation is what does the acquainting, right? So like when I look and I see that red apple, maybe a form of weak representationalism would say, oh, well, that I look at that and my brain perceives it and it makes a red apple. It represents the red apple in my head. And then I see that representation in my mind's eye, and that's how I know it's an apple, right? But I would not say that. I would say that when my brain, when my eyes or whatever perceive the red apple, they represent it to me, and that representation is what acquaints me with the apple. So I'm not acquainted with the representation. The representation is doing the acquainting. which is, so I would say that in general, whenever we perceive, we're acquainted with whatever is being represented to us. And when that representation is accurate, then we're acquainted with the real world. And when it's inaccurate, then we're acquainted with some sort of hallucination or some sort of thing that does not exist, right? And I think that the last thing I'll say about that is I think that's intuitively plausible for a lot of things. Like, so for example, if you look at like a bag or like a box, and on the box it says apples, right? You are directly, that word apples represents the fact that the box is filled with apples, right? And when you read that word apples, you're directly acquainted with that fact that the box is filled with apples. You're not directly acquainted with like some fact of apple containingness, right? It's not that by representing the fact that the box is filled with apples, I come in contact with that representation of that fact. It's that the representation is what acquaints me directly with that fact. So I think that's how a lot of us would consider, I think the last example I'll give is like Frank Jackson talks about like the gas gauge in your car, right? Like when it's on full, right, you're acquainted with the level of gas in your car. You look at that and you automatically say, okay, my gas tank is full. You're not acquainted with like some platonic essence of fullness that has been represented to you. It's just that the thing is representing the fact itself, and you're just directly acquainted with that fact.
Yeah. Okay. I'm wondering what the Platonic stuff was doing in there, because I mean, I guess I would sort of say that there's nothing sort of abstract going on, even in the case of there being some mental item that I'm sort of directly apprehending. That is still a concrete state of affairs. So
sure, I'm just, in that case example, it has to be Platonic, right? Just because like a proposition like that would be like a Platonic thing. So I'm not saying that you're committed in other representationalists or other weak representationalists committed to that because of Platonism. In that example, it would have to be, right. But you're totally right. You can believe that qualia, there are like these concrete qualia instances, right? I mean, there are complex issues with qualia that have to do with universals and things like that, but that's neither here nor there. But my point is that there are instances of representation where we don't intuitively think that we are coming in contact with the representation, but rather coming in contact with something through the representation. And that understanding that we have in other situations is also, in my view, the correct understanding we should have for perception, right? And so it's sort of just a way of priming that intuition of that just because something is being represented to you doesn't mean that you come in contact with the representation. The act of representing can itself be the thing, the means by which you become acquainted with something out there in the world.
Okay, that's interesting. That was going to be something I was going to clarify. So would you say then, when you're, say, representing an object like an apple or whatever, that there's no thing that is the representation in your mind, but that your mind is representing it?
Yes, I would say representation is like an action, right? Okay. So a great example that people use sometimes is like the idea of like a kick, right? So like, I don't know, again, you're from the UK, so there's a higher chance that you are into soccer, or at least watch it sometimes, right? So, although I guess you'd call it football, right? But, you can talk about someone having a kick, right? Like, oh, that guy has a great kick, right? And it's expressed in a way that makes it sound as though you have an object called a kick, right? But in reality, what we say is a kick and refer to it as a noun is actually a verb, right? It's a single tag for like a behavior of kicking the ball in a certain way, right? And so I would say there's a sort of similar dynamic going on here where we'd say, when you say like, I have an experience of an apple, what you're really saying is I'm experiencing the apple, right? Like I'm doing something. So I would say when I say like, I have a representation of, this, this tree I'm looking at, I would say there's no thing that is the representation. It's rather that it is being represented, in the same way that there's no such thing as the kick, but we just would speak that way to say the act of kicking, right? So that's sort of how I would see that. Representation is taking place, but there is not a representation that I am encountering.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it might need to sort of clarify that a little bit more in later on, but let's move on to the bit about illusionism. So, I mean, I suppose you have sort of already kind of sketched illusionism out. Is there anything on those questions there that you wanted to kind of cover?
Yeah, the one thing I'd say there is it is important to make a distinction between a sort of spectrum of views between what you might call like classic, and it's funny to call it classic because it's like 10 years old as a official term, but classic illusionism, and then what you might call delusionism, right? So illusionism would be more like the idea that phenomenal properties don't exist and your brain is actually like intentionally is the wrong word, but your brain is specifically functioning so that you do have the experience of phenomenality, right? So illusionism, it is an illusion. Your brain is sort of actively misleading you, right? Versus on the other end, you might have something that you see reflected in maybe earlier theorists like early Dennett. You get a little bit of like in Richard Rorty, and things like that. More delusionism is more like your brain isn't representing these things phenomenally. You're just misunderstanding them for like various cultural or conceptual reasons, right? And so obviously it's not a broad spectrum, right? Because both of those views are very close together in the whole range of philosophy of mind. But it is an important thing in the sense that like illusionism, there are different brands of illusionism that are going to be more or less emphasizing the sort of active misleading, right? So like Keith Frankish, you read some of his work and he seems to have this real sense that your brain is really sort of being like, hey, I'm going to trick this guy into thinking there's phenomenality, right? That kind of idea of like, it's like a real misrepresentation. Whereas you read more early Dennett and it's more like, look at this guy. He's convinced himself this stuff is phenomenal because he's reading too much into his brain's more neutral presentation of things, right? So, for me, I fall somewhere in the middle, right? I would say that, like, I think illusion is, or phenomenality is a legitimate introspective illusion. It is truly being misrepresented in some way, but also that we have compounded that misrepresentation with various theoretical errors, right? And so that's the only other thing I'd say about illusionism, right? Is that, if you want to be, you can be an illusionist who says our common sense view of phenomenality is 100% correct. That is the way your brain is representing it. It's just an illusion. And then you can go on the far end and you could say, actually, all this talk about qualia, all this talk about phenomenality, it's all just a theoretical mistake and you're blaming your brain for it, but it's your fault, not your brain, And then somewhere in the middle where you can say, yes, there is legitimate illusory introspective illusion, but we have compounded that with various, cultural and ideological, theoretical errors. And that's where I would land, right? So I would say your brain is, it is legitimately off, but we have also gone too bad. So the last thing I'll say about that is like a good comparison might be like this computer, right? So like a desktop is a classic example of an illusion, right? Because there's stuff on the desktop represents meaningful stuff and it's useful and helpful. But of course, when I drag a file into the recycle bin, there's no corresponding file on the disk that gets moved somewhere, right? It all happens in an imperceptible way with little bits moving back and forth in a way I could never understand, but it's represented to me in an illusory sense there, right? So I would say that's kind of like how we should understand the illusionist view of consciousness. But then someone might also use a computer for a long time and sort of like internalize some of this stuff and read too much into it and come to their own theory on like how folders work that's not accurate, and people have that, right? People have like kind of full conceptions of how computers work that aren't accurate. And it's like, that's not the computer's fault. That's your fault. But there is still a legitimate misrepresentation going on.
Got you. And when it comes to something like the like sort of display of like a computer screen, I mean, I sort of agree with a lot of things that sort of Dennett says on this, and I like that this is kind of like a toy case, sort of kind of compared to the phenomenon of being conscious. How does I guess I'm trying to think in terms of. So I'm wanting to make that a similar point to what I made earlier around that sort of like generic response to illusionism, because I think that the like a conscious experience exists sort of concretely in the way that sort of a screen display exists concretely, but presumably an illusionist would want to say, well, there's not really the screen display there.
Yes.
There's something kind of different, so that the analogy is slightly more nuanced than that.
Yeah, you're totally right. The common comeback is like, well, you're still perceiving the screen, right? So you can't only that way. But you could imagine a computer that does not work that way, that is entirely internally represented, right? And so you can imagine, for example, having maybe you are making an android, right, that has no sort of perceptive awareness in that way, but is internally it's perceptive, I guess, but doesn't have any phenomenal consciousness, right? And instead, when the android looks around, it receives only propositions, right? So you can think of the android's mind is blank inside, and but whenever it looks, it just has thoughts, right? So it looks and sees a tree, but instead of seeing a tree the way we do, instead just the proposition, there is a tree in front of you about 20 feet, pops into their head, right? And as they look, they look around, it's just a bunch of propositions popping into their head, a bunch of facts, right? You could imagine a being like that. In fact, you could argue that it would be totally possible that we would have evolved that way, right? We could have evolved without any phenomenality, and instead we read the book of the world instead of watching the movie of the world, right? And there's nothing weird about that. That could happen. That could have happened. But in that case, you could still have an illusory system like the one I'm describing, right? You could still say to the android, hey, if you're feeling weird, make sure you go and update your drivers in your brain, right? And they get that proposition and they go through that, even though just on that propositional level, it would be an illusion, right? Because obviously there is no such thing in the bits on the drive that corresponds directly to the driver, right? Or, update your software. It's like, so even without any perceptive awareness, you could think of a system internally representing things to itself in a misleading way, right? And so you're right, of course, that analogy fails because it involves perception, but you could make that analogy in a way that didn't involve perception, and the main point would still be there because it'd still be an internally represented system.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if like a good analogy might be like a camera, like a digital camera or something like that. So like take my phone, for example. I can sort of move this around and record various things. But normally what happens is I see a screen that I'm kind of acquainted with. But what we don't want to do is put that screen inside the mind and
exactly
Cartesian theater. So I'm wondering if like quite an apt analogy might be something like a digital camera that is recording, but the screen or it doesn't have a screen, or the screen is in use. So that there's representing going on. There's no representation as such.
I mean, you could take a digital camera, remove the screen, and then you point the digital camera at someone, and it could still identify their face, right? Like those cameras now that they see a face and they autofocus or whatever, right? And that would be a good example of like inside the system of the digital camera, that is an illusion, right? Like the camera is not actually seeking out faces. Rather, it's seeking out all these, it has some matrix it's trained on that, correlates with the features of various faces and all that, right? So even there, you might say that, the digital camera has been programmed in an illusory way where it's been programmed to work kind of at the level of faces, but that is a misrepresentation of what's really going on in like the nuts and bolts of the program, right? But yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. It's like a camera turned, or a computer with its screen turned off, right? That you could somehow jack directly into or something like that. But in that case, you would say that there's still the possibility of illusion, right? And so another analogy I think is really helpful is the idea of facial recognition, right? That we have, right? So I think about like, I've never met you before, right? But if I saw you a couple days from now, I would probably be like, oh, is that Daniel? I remember that, right? And I couldn't tell you why I knew that, right? Like I wouldn't be like, oh yes, it's because Daniel had eyes that were set this far apart and a nose that was, it would just happen, right? I would look at you, and sort of layered over my phenomenal experience would be this extra thing of like Danielness that I can't explain, but that would just be immediately apparent, right? And so illusionists would, and there are people with facial blindness who can't do that, right? So I was actually, to prepare for this, I was reading about this, and I read an interesting article about this woman who had face blindness, and she had 3 sons, and she was like, I just have a list in my head of like brown hair, mole on cheek, 1 earring, that's Billy, and like, 6 feet tall and skinny, that's Johnny, you know what I mean, right? And just every time she looked at someone, with her kids, she had to, instead of just being immediately aware of who they were, she had to kind of she had to draw the first level details and then match them in her head, right? And so I think that's a great metaphor for what illusionists sort of think is happening in perception in general, right? Is that our bodies are taking in perceptively a huge amount of information. And instead of making it so that we have to take in all of that information and synthesize it ourselves, it instead represents that information to us as a sort of single little phenomenal tag, right? So in the same way that like I see, my wife's face, and like instead of me being like, oh, there are the eyes, there are the nose, blah, blah, my brain does that for me and just plops a little tag of like, that's your wife, right? The illusionist would say that that's actually what my brain is doing with all phenomenal things, right? So when I look at, a red apple and then a red tomato, right? Instead of my brain just telling me all of these facts about the reflective properties of one and the reflective properties of the other, it just takes a simple phenomenal tag, which of course I believe is a quasi-phenomenal tag, right? It's not really phenomenal, but it creates this simple illusion of saying these two things, it communicates to you, these two things have the same reflective profile. And it could communicate that to you without phenomenality. But phenomenality is this sort of illusory thing that makes that immediately apparent, right? And so that's sort of what I'm getting at with illusionism here, is to say that really all perception, all phenomenal experience is the mind just sort of taking this complex cluster of physical happenings and data, and then just sort of creating this simple illusion that makes us be able to work with it in an effective way.
Yeah, okay. Got you. What I'm thinking of doing is just moving on to the bit about what motivates illusions, what motivates illusionism. And I've kind of got a bit of a way that I want to tackle this. So let me just get my notes. So I guess so I've got the question, like, where does illusionism enter the dialectic? And I'm imagining sort of 2 possible routes that you could kind of go. So the first one, so going back a little bit in time to the sort of primary, secondary quality debate, where it's kind of like, I mean, I guess let's do it like this. So we start off with people kind of being naive realists and just thinking that all the qualities are kind of out there in the world. And then we have the sort of problems of perception and like hallucination. And then people kind of started to say, okay, well, maybe those properties aren't really out there. They're kind of in here.
Yeah, for sure.
But then we kind of get like the hard problem of consciousness. And then that leads people to kind of say, well, they're not out there, but they're not in here either. And then you kind of end up with this fairly austere view where there are no qualities kind of anywhere. That's one version, which I wondered whether that resonates at all with you and what you think. The other view might be something a bit more like this. So you start off sort of as direct realists, qualities are out there. Same step with problems of perception and the primary secondary quality debate, end up saying that those kind of mental qualities are in here. But then there's a hard problem, and okay, so we just dump those qualities back out onto the world. And that second route where we go, okay, no, the qualities really are out there, That's a view that I'm sort of, I guess, currently flirting with. I think of that as being more of a form of like direct realism again. I mean, is there one of those that sort of resonates more with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. That you can sort of think of it as it is a dialectic, right? Because no one would come to illusionism just sort of out of nowhere, right? You're totally, I think you're 100% correct that we have this like, well, certainly, it seems like just naive realism, but then you're right. You're like, oh, well, yeah, it's probably in the head. And you're like, well, it can't be in the head. So it's probably at the, what I do. I think there's sort of a positive and negative way to think about it, right? Because, and so I would say that I think about illusionism as sort of if you talk about a dialectic in a like a traditional Hegelian sense or whatever, it is a synthesis, right? Because I think illusionism starts with taking two intuitions very seriously. And the first intuition is that phenomenal things do seem to be very different from physical things, right? Like when I close my eyes and I think of a red patch, right? It does seem to be a sort of unextended mental thing that is distinct from any physical object. And I think that intuition is there for a lot of people, for a lot of people. And then you have I wouldn't say it's an intuition, but I would say you have the considered stance of physicalism, right? Where you would say it does seem like there shouldn't be properties like that, right? Like it does seem like there should not be any objects that are ineffable and private and directly ascertainable in this way, right? If you have a broadly naturalistic, broadly physicalist mindset, that does not seem like something that should be the case. And so you have these two dueling intuitions. And, the dualist says, forget physicalism. I'm going with how introspectively it seems to me. And the physicalist says, forget how introspectively it seems to me, I'm going with physicalism. And I think idealism kind of is able to resolve those two things by saying, yes, it does seem that way. And no, it's not actually that way, right? In exactly the same way where, again, I keep going back to actual magic tricks, right? Like if you talk to, if you go to a magic show, right? It's a funny thing I've actually seen happen where you maybe have this experience where someone will see a magic trick that's like so crazy that they have to start pretending it's not that impressive, right? Like someone will do like the craziest magic trick in the world, and one guy is like, "That's insane! How did you do that?" And the other guy's like, "No, not that big of a deal." Because it's like if I admitted it was that big of a deal, I'd have to be like, "How the hell did he do that?" You know what I mean? And so like for me, it's like that where I want to be like, yes, it does seem like it has all of these impossible properties. Yes, we know those impossible properties, or at least we have very good reason to think those impossible properties don't exist. So the best possible way to synthesize those two things is to say that those properties are illusory, that they appear that way, but they aren't actually that way. And I don't like to be too triumphalist about this, but I think Dennett was right when he says this is the default, obvious view of consciousness, right? Anytime you encounter something in the world that seems to have dramatically weird properties, and you know that it shouldn't have them, the default position is to think that you're just looking at it wrong, right? Like if we found a rock out there that was somehow able, this material is somehow able to hover in the air, or it looks like it's doing something crazy like that, and then we say, but there's no way it should ever be able to do that, then we just be like, okay, it must be an optical illusion, right? If someone shows you that Penrose triangle, the impossible triangle, you say, wow, it really looks like it's always going in one direction, or those stair steps, it looks like it's always going up, but I know stair steps can't always go up. So it must be an optical illusion, right? In that sense, that's, I think, the dialectic that illusionism is in more broadly, is we want to affirm the intuitions we have about our experiences. We want to affirm our scientific picture of the world that says those qualities and those properties can't be the case. Here's a really easy way to do it. And all it requires is accepting that intuition sometimes gets it wrong. And I just feel like for me, this is where people weight things differently. But for me, I would say I am so willing to accept that intuition might get things wrong, right? Like to me, it's, as an atheist, as a naturalist, it seems crazy to me to think that your brain would have any interest in representing these things correctly to you. That's why I think the analogy with the computer is correct, right? Nobody thinks the person who made the computer was like, how do I really communicate to the user exactly what's happening on the disk drive, right? They don't care. They just want it to be usable. And sometimes it's easier to use if you misrepresent stuff. And so I think that, illusionism is one of those things where people think the big thing you have to get over is like some direct, immediate sense of the world. And you have to somehow train yourself to like not believe in phenomenality, right? But the only thing you have to get over with illusionism is trust in your own introspective abilities. And I think there are a bunch of reasons to think that that's not true. And I think we can even just intuitively, there are all sorts of situations where we're like, oh yeah, I'm introspecting incorrectly.
Yeah, there's a lot that I agree with there. And yeah, I find myself in this kind of odd tension where I'm fairly committed to like some sort of phenomenal properties, but on the other hand, I allow for the fact that we can be radically sort of mistaken about them. So I mean, I guess to that extent, I'm happy with like weak illusionism. It's just the extent to which I can go the whole way, kind of thing. But so for example, like having like psychotherapy, which is something that I've been doing for the last year and a little bit more. It's really baffling how it's kind of often brought to my attention how I sort of like notice how wrong I am about the way I'm feeling,
absolutely,
and that kind of thing. So there's definitely some intuitions going on where I'm like, okay, I can stomach this. It's sometimes, there's just moments where I'm like, but it seems like there are some things that I just can't be wrong about. But I'll have to.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend or whatever, and I was just like, I looked at a pic. I used to have really bad long hair, like when I was like 16, that just looked terrible, right? And I just was telling my friend, I was like, looking at a picture of me in high school, and I was like, illusionism, it got to be true, because there was a time when I looked at this and I thought it looked cool, right? And I'm just like, clearly I could be really wrong about what I'm perceiving, right? You know what I mean? Like, so, and obviously that's a very different thing, but I think that, I think you're totally right that things like meditation, things like psychotherapy, any sort of kind of deep introspective emotional thing, like it often does, I think, really show like, wow, even that I could be incorrect about, right? And like illusionism, it's bad when illusionism boils down to just a bunch of parlor tricks where you're like, oh, look at this, look at this optical illusion, look at this funny trick, but those can be really helpful ways of showing like, wow, I can't believe I was that wrong. And once you kind of destabilize that, that kind of confidence and introspection, it can be very easy to sort of latch on to illusionism as like a way of reconciling that. And the very last thing I'll say about that too is it's important. The other nice thing about illusionism is that it's not saying that we're just like radically wrong in these ways that make no sense, right? It's that we're wrong in ways that make sense, and that we're able to check our wrongness by looking at that theory, right? So like another example I've used is like driving, right? Like, I don't know if you've ever driven a car from like the 1960s, but one thing you recognize is like you actually are turning the wheels when you turn the steering wheel. Nowadays, that's not true, right? Nowadays, when you turn the steering wheel, it just activates something in your car that turns the wheels, right? You are not doing it, right? So like, that's an illusion, right? It's an illusion that when you turn the wheel, you're actually turning the car's wheels. But it's like an illusion that makes sense. And if you told someone, hey, like when you turn the car wheel, it also, it's actually, that just sends a signal to the machine, and the machine turns the wheels. They wouldn't suddenly be like, oh no, now I'm worried that when my car says I'm going 80 miles or, 60 miles an hour, I'm actually going 90 miles an hour, right? Like you wouldn't start being afraid of just random misrepresentation, because you understand where the misrepresentations you do see are coming from. And so that's the other thing I'd say is like, people don't need to be afraid that illusionism leads to this sort of radical skepticism where we could just be wrong about everything, because it also paints a clear, verifiable, like testable set of standards for when we might face illusions. And when we're not in those contexts, we don't need to be afraid that there just might be a random illusion that evolution threw in just for fun. We can always say like, well, we have this criteria for when we should and shouldn't think there might be illusions.
I wanted to back up just quickly and check. So in the two views that I sort of sketched, are you, so I'm kind of talking about qualities, and I'm being kind of vague about what they are, because they might be these things that are out there in the world. They also might be these things that are in here in my mind. And I always find that kind of funny, because they would be such radically different properties in each case, but at the same time somehow they're really confusing. But I guess my commitment is that at least one or other of them exists, and so that they may be mental properties, they may just be real properties out there in the world. Are you happy with a view where those I mean, I guess I kind of want to ask you, what do you think about qualities in general? Because in my thinking, qualities are kind of like running the show, so to speak. And that's a commitment I have, whether or not I end up being an idealist, which might make a sort of move in identifying qualities with just being phenomenal properties. And so I tend to have this kind of view where the qualitative is that, like we were talking earlier about like monism, like I'm a sort of quality monist, and like everything is qualities. What's your view about qualities? Like, do they exist anywhere?
Well, it depends if you're talking about phenomenal qualities or not, right? Because I would obviously say qualities exist, right? Like, so, you know, if I hold this, whatever, like, I think this has the quality of being circular or you know, oblong or whatever the correct term would be, right? And so I think that's true, right? So this, I don't want to go too deep on this, because this could be an entire other thing, because there's like a three-dimensional thing here of like, do the qualities exist really or not? Do they exist internally or externally? And do they exist like as properties of us or as properties of the object, right? You can kind of, there are like 9 different, or you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9 different possible ways you could kind of make that big compass. But generally, I would say that there are some things that are qualities of objects, and some things that are there are some things that are qualities of objects that are represented to us internally in a way that is misleading. And then there are some things that are not even qualities of objects at all, but are only represented to us, right? So color is a good example. You know, I don't love taking this position all the time, and there are times where I think it's too radical, but I would say like Frank Jackson says, that like color is almost like a double illusion, right? Where it's like, it's not just the phenomenality being the illusion, but also that there's any property that phenomenality relates to. Whereas like, I don't think that shape is a double illusion in that sense, right? I do think that if we have a phenomenal, you know, this phenomenal, supposedly phenomenal experience of like a square box, then I think even if that phenomenal experience is incorrect, I do think you can say that the box has an actual property of squareness, right? Or cubeness, right? So that's a distinction to make, right? There are some things what I would say, you know, I don't believe that any phenomenal properties correspond to real life, but I do think that sometimes those phenomenal properties are those representations of those phenomenal properties are representing something that actually the object has, and sometimes they are completely new illusions that are designed to fulfill some other kind of secondary purpose. You know, so that, but that's a very complex thing. I probably did not lay that out very well. But yes, I agree with you that there are still features of objects in the world, right? For sure. And that sometimes those features are represented to us phenomenally. And there I would say that phenomenal representation is an illusion, but those qualities still exist. And other times, the phenomenal representation is an illusion, and also what it sort of purports to be is also not real. So it's like doubly false, right? But I don't have a strong theory about what falls in what category.
Got you. No, that made perfect sense. Okay, where should we go from here?
So I probably got to wrap it up about noon. So let's try and hit some of this stuff maybe about. Let me say something about this, about what are quasi-phenomenal properties, right?
Yeah, that'd be worth addressing.
Yeah. So I don't know where this term originates, but I think it just comes from Keith Frankish talking about the idea. He's like, you know, look, even if you're an illusionist, you have to obviously, people are talking about something when they talk about like the color green, right? Like it, you know, I don't think you should be a sort of head in the sand illusionist where you're just like, oh no, that's meaningless, you know. I think it's obviously, I know what people mean when they say the color green. And so I would say that, you know, we should have some way of referring to the sort of thing that we internally represent in an illusory way as green, right? And so if we want to say that there's this quasi-phenomenal property of being the sort of thing that would make you have the illusion of greenness, and we call it green star or whatever, like I don't think there's a problem with that, but I do think that quasi-phenomenal properties are distinct from phenomenal properties in a way where I don't think it's possible to just kind of retarget our language, right? I do think that it's valuable to have the concept of quasi-phenomenal properties, but I also think that it's important to say that it can't just be a new name. You can't just add quasi onto phenomenal properties and the problem solved, right? So I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are on that, because I think that's one area where you were seemed maybe a little more open to kind of resolving the dispute in that way. But I'd be curious to know what you think on that.
Yeah, before I come in on that, I think I'm not sure if all of that went in. What did you say that, like, did you sort of characterize what a quasi-phenomenal property would be as opposed to a phenomenal property?
Yeah, so I would say like a quasi-phenomenal property would be a property of some sort of representation, but it would not be a property that would have any of the features of actual phenomenality, right? So a quasi-phenomenal, you know, a super loose metaphor would be that like a quasi-phenomenal property would be like the VHS tape, and the phenomenal property would be like the movie that it plays, right? In the sense that, like, we can say there are no actual phenomenal properties, but there are these things that, when inwardly considered, appear to us to be phenomenal, right? In the same way that maybe like you know, like a VHS tape, inwardly considered inside the VHS player, it, you know, plays this movie, right? And so of course the movie does exist, but we would say that in our life, you know, in our minds, we would say, you know, that movie is an illusion. It doesn't actually exist, but there is something that is causing it to exist, or, you know, sorry, causing it to appear as though it exists. And we do need a name for that thing, right? Because obviously people see green or red or blue or whatever in particular conditions, right? And so we can say, like, whatever it is that is causing you to have this introspective illusion of greenness, that is the quasi-phenomenal property of greenness. But that quasi-phenomenal property would be a physical property, right? It would be a property of certain brain states, and it would not have any sort of internal, ineffable, direct, experiential anything, right? It would just be the brain data that's causing you to have that illusion.
Okay. Yeah. So it's something that causes you to have that seeming that that some phenomenal properties exist, whether that be like colors or textures or whatever.
Maybe another metaphor. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but there are interesting artists, right, who they'll make like a pile of junk that just looks like nothing. But if you look at it from exactly one perspective, it'll look like a face or something, right? And so you might say, like, the pile of junk is the quasi-phenomenal property and the face is the phenomenal property, right? Like, the phenomenal property is what happens when the quasi-phenomenal property is interpreted or engaged with from a specific perspective, right? And so we would say, you know, if you have a pile of junk where from one perspective it looks like a face, that pile of junk does not have any features of a face, right? There is no jaw to the pile of junk, right? But when viewed a certain way, it appears to have a jaw. And so we would say the property of jaw having is a property of this, you know, face that doesn't really exist, but it's not a property of the thing that made you see it.
Got you. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And just to push this analogy a bit further, would there's the junk, and then there's the nice shadow, which has a more elegant and slightly more contrived like shape to it. In this analogy, is what's playing the role of the junk? Like, is that literally something going on like in the brain, or
Yeah, I would say it would be like,
could it be something in the world as well? Or
ooh, that's an interesting question, right? That's a good question. I haven't really thought that much about that, but just from you asking that, it's true that you could say the quasi-phenomenal property was a property of the object, right? To me, illusionism, I guess, would be agnostic on that, right? You could say like the quasi-phenomenal property is actually the particular reflective profile of the apple's skin, and the phenomenal property is the redness that our brain interprets it as. Or you could say the quasi-phenomenal property would be, the set of electrochemical signals that is generated by that perception. I think you could do it either way. I mean, there might be good reasons to have one or another that I haven't thought about, but yeah, I think you could do either. You can have a kind of an outward-facing illusionism or more inward-facing illusionism. I mean, I'm drawn to outward-facing on everything, right? So right away, I'm like, maybe I should rethink that. Maybe I should say that the quasi-phenomenal properties are properties of objects. That maybe would be a better way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think as I've been trying to work out my views in the philosophy of mind, like I've gone back and forth on this issue around what these phenomenal properties are, and I know that there are some people who are happy to say they're kind of things out there, so to speak. And so yeah, I mean, you might have noticed through this conversation, like that's almost something that I'm keeping as an open possibility.
Yeah.
So when I'm thinking about qualia, when I'm thinking about phenomenal properties, and I suppose it would pull through into thinking about quasi-phenomenal properties, even though I'm not always sure what I'm supposed to be thinking about in that scenario. Like, I think in either way, I'd be entertaining the possibility that they could be, I guess, internal. They could be external. And I think, I mean, the way that I approach a lot of this stuff, I'm not taking any particular view sort of for granted. I think I might have said this to you before, but I guess what I'm interested in is the sort of phenomenology, and I'm open to that being like the ways that the world is. I'm open to that being ways that I'm experiencing the world to be, even though the world might not be that way. And so yeah, and I haven't read massively into like the history of kind of qualia, but it does seem like a few of those people who are sort of instrumental in kind of starting off that conversation, but might have had that sort of flexibility.
Yeah, for sure.
At the start as well. So yeah, but yeah. Yeah,
I think that's really, I was just saying, I think it's a really important point to make, right? Like, wherever anybody falls on illusionism, if there's that one thing I really drive home, right, is that like illusionism does not require that you don't take your experiences seriously, right? Like, a lot of people think that when people talk about something being an illusion, that means that you should somehow not care about it or disrespect it or whatever, right? It's like, but like whatever weight you put on your experiences, which should be a lot, like you can bring that into illusionism. In fact, Daniel Dennett has a really funny story I love, where he talks about, he was writing a book on stage magic, right? And some guy was like, "Hey, what are you writing?" He's like, "Oh, I'm writing a book on magic." And the guy said, "Are you talking about real magic or fake magic?" Right. And he's like, "Well, it's funny that real magic is the magic that doesn't exist, and fake magic is the magic that actually happens." Right. And, I feel that way with like, people come to me with like illusionism, and they're like, "Well, do you mean real consciousness, or do you mean like illusionist consciousness?" And I'm like, well, obviously, I think real consciousness should be the kind that really exists. Right. And so I think there's a sense in which I really do believe that illusionism honors our phenomenology in a really meaningful way that maybe other theories don't, because it says, instead of taking our phenomenology and kind of reifying it into this like kind of abstract thing that is totally detached from our larger picture of the world, it integrates it into it and says, hey, this is why this is happening, right? Like, I don't know, for me personally, on almost like a spiritual level or whatever, right? I love the idea that like I look at this apple and I'm not seeing redness because there's just some inherent redness in the universe floating around, but because millions of years of evolution have led me to have a brain that sees that apple that doesn't actually have any color, and it imbues it with color. right? And it's, yeah, that color isn't really real. It's not out there in the world, but it's meaningful, right? It's there for a purpose, you know? So there are some people who talk about, instead of talking about realism or irrealism, they talk about phenomenal surrealism, right? Where they're like, you know, yeah, it's not real, but it's like, its unreality is really important and meaningful, right? And so, you know, when you're an illusionist, this isn't maybe a good reason to become an illusionist, but it's comforting if you're weirded out by illusionism to say, like, you get to have this wonderful view where, like, every time you look in the world, your brain is just populating the whole universe with this rich phenomenology that it's making up as it goes for you, right?
Yeah.
And, like, I think that's cool. I think people who look at illusionism as this really dour, tragic thing that, oh, the world's actually totally lifeless and you're just deluded or whatever. It's like, you know, I don't think about it that way. I think about it as like, oh, how cool is it that when I, you know, look out into the world, it's like all of this is what my brain is doing for me. You know, it's not just something out in the world I'm grabbing. It's something I'm doing, actively participating in the construction of this phenomenology, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but I agree with you that you can have all sorts of different perspectives on that. You don't, you know, both illusionism and qualia theory kind of have those internal and external versions for sure.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and I think that's maybe what I have a problem with, in that whichever way I think about this, I'm, I guess, a bit troubled about how whether we go for some sort of phenomenal realism or the sort of quasi-phenomenal version. I guess I can't grasp what that would mean for a brain to do those things. Like, it still sounds like quite magical, and it still seems like there's something there that shouldn't be there, given a kind of, at least one way of thinking about kind of physicalism, where you've just got a whole bunch of concrete stuff that is just like causally interacting with other stuff. Yeah, I don't know if that kind of made any sense.
No, I think you're totally right. And I think that's the other thing. And maybe, you know, this would be a kind of good point to end on, right? Is that, like, illusionism, no theory out there says I've got it all figured out, right? Like, obvious, like, dualists have interaction problems. Physicalists who aren't illusionists have all sorts of problems with emergence, right? Idealists have their own problems. But illusionism specifically, I think, is a very humble philosophy, in the sense that it's saying somehow our brains are doing this. And I think every illusionist would say, and we don't really get how, right? Like, I do think that it is important, if you are an illusionist, to not act as though we have it all figured out, right? This is a research program, right? And I think illusionism just in general is a very humble philosophy, saying we just don't understand this very well enough, right? Like, you know, and again, just going back, talking about actual magic tricks, right? I have seen magic tricks where I'm like, there is no way you can do that. Like, you must actually be magic or whatever. And then, you know, I look on a YouTube video about how they did it, and I'm just like, I never would have even thought of that, right? Like, I didn't even have the concept of, you know, that kind of shuffle, or I didn't even realize that a mirror could be used that way, or, you know what I mean? One of those things where it's like, I never in a million years would I figured it out. And I feel like that's the position that I take right now with my own, with phenomenal properties and quasi-phenomenal properties, is like, I'm confident that there is a trick going on here, but I don't know what that trick is, and I don't pretend to know, and I want to find out. And I feel like I might, right? Like, that's the other thing I will say too, is that illusionism is in some sense it has less of a formidable weight to it than, like, centuries old ideas like dualism, or even a lot of more classic physicalism. But it's also, like, has so much room to grow, right? Like, in 100 years, what we know about cognitive neuroscience is going to be so different. And maybe the problem will still be there. Who knows, right? I'm not going to say that there's, you know, we're definitely going to crack it in 100 years. Could be a lot longer than that, right? We could be in the absolute infancy of our understanding of cognition. But at the very least, I think that anybody who is confidently willing to rule out the possibility of introspective illusions like this, I think I'm like, even if you're comfortable enough with another view to say, I think that view is more plausible. You know, I think dualism is more plausible. Totally fine. But anybody who's like, there's just no way the mind could be representing things as phenomenal when they actually aren't. I'm just like, that's a really confident statement at our level of, you know, of handling things, right? In the same way that, you know, if someone in 1600 was like, there's just no way that something could be a particle and a wave at the same time, I would just be like, just wait 500 years, man, you know, wait 400 years and or 300 years or whatever, and you'll find out, right? You know, and so I think that's where I would sort of leave it, is like illusionism is really just the idea that right now we should be humble about our introspective abilities and be at least very willing to consider that they're systematically misrepresenting things in a way that we will eventually be able to account for. And I think that uncertainty is really unappealing to people, but for other people like me, I think it's very appealing. I'm glad I don't have to pretend to have all the answers in the way that someone who is maybe a dualist might have to sort of be like, no, we got this figured out, you know, because not to throw shade at dualists, but there is like a sense of with like, if you don't have it by now, like there's no empirical observation that you're doing here, right? Like if you haven't been able to sit in your armchair and reason out how your mind works by now, I have very little faith you're eventually going to do it. But if we're talking about this more empirically grounded thing that is taking specific instances of neurochemical and neuroscientific facts as its basis, I'm like, there's room to grow there. So even if someone ultimately decides, you know, illusionism isn't for me right now, I'm just like, you know, check back in 20 years, you know, and if you think when you check back in 20 years, there might really be something, then maybe today you should be more willing to consider it. So that's my final sales pitch or whatever. But yeah.
You said you've got to get off. Do you have time for like one more question?
Yeah, go ahead for sure.
So the last one I'll ask is, so I wondered if illusionism and representationalism is like an odd pair of views in just, I don't want to rehash what we've already spoken about, but the thought was that, you know, that there are sort of strong representationalists who are happy to be sort of realists about qualia in that sort of weak sense, and to that extent, shouldn't they just be phenomenal realists? Like, doesn't representationalism sort of entail some sort of weak phenomenal realism? That was, I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it depends. I think you can be a representation. I think you can be a weak representationalist really easily and believe in qualia, right? Because you can just be like, oh yeah, qualia is the representation, right? But if you sort of say like, there is nothing, if you take this sort of hard representationalism where you say there is nothing to the representation other than the information being given, right? Then I think it's hard to find a space for qualia in there. Right. Because if you say, if you believe that like to see something is just to have it represented to you in the sense that the representation is the perception, then I think it's hard to say, you know, because then you'd have to say that you are literally perceiving the qualia. Right. And it's like, that is not representationalism, right? Because to make that representationalism, you'd have almost like an endless regress of like, you would need the qualia represented to you and then you engage with that. But it's like, well, then how is that represented to you? You know, so I think you can have like a weak representationalism where you say qualia just is the representation and you are directly acquainted with the qualia. But if you really go hard representationalism, I think at least illusionism is a natural fit because because you can say, you know, the representation is doing the acquainting. It's getting you that information and that it's being represented to you in a certain way, not that the representation has certain features. In some way, the last thing I'll say is, in some way, it's funny that like weak and strong representationalism almost feel like they should be switched to me, right? Like, because I'm like, in some sense, like weak representationalism is like,
and I see that.
Yeah, is like, well, that's the one where you have like this hardcore thing you can look at called like the representation or whatever, you know what I mean? But but obviously I get why they say that, but or why they are called that. But yeah, I mean, I think if you take a really consistent, strong representationalist position, illusionism is a good fit. And I think a lot of the features of qualia are difficult to fit into that framework of representationalism, although there are people who do it. But I think that's tough for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I was under the assumption that there were quite a few strong representationalists who are sort of physicalists, but would allow some form of like qualia or
for sure, there
property.
definitely are.
Like I'm thinking of like Michael Tai,
Yes.
although I know he's the panpsychist now, and I wondered to what extent this has anything to do with that. But yeah, like so if you think that you can give a full account of qualia in representationalist terms, so that the two are literally sort of they come as like a metaphysical package deal, so to speak. Like let me just grab my notes very quickly. So yeah, so strong representationalism is supposed to be compatible with physicalism/functionalism. Conscious mental states have no mental properties other than their representational properties, and then representational properties fix the phenomenal properties. So in that sense, like I took that to be like, I guess, one form of so you could allow for, I guess, what I said at the start of that weak sense of qualia, but still a sense of qualia. But just not, because I think once we get into the weak representationalism, I think that's much more liberal, and I think that's where you can even go for that, like what I was calling the level 2 or like the medium weight version. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know if perhaps that's one to think more about, but so I guess coming back to my question, I wondered if illusionism is even compatible. I guess it wouldn't be compatible with that kind of strong representationalism, but perhaps it's a different kind of representationalism altogether, where there's no objects there. There's just representing rather than representation, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that they're definitely they could fit in any way you want, right? I don't think there's any part of it is going to totally rule out some things, but I think they fit well together, right? Like there is a clear representationalist account of illusionism, I guess how I say it, right? Or even you would say an illusionist account of representationalism, or however you want to, which one you want to kind of make the central focus. But but I do think that they fit well together. But you're right that it isn't, I think you're right that you can be a hard representation or strong representationalist and still believe in quality. I just think that once you do that, I don't see what it gets you, right? Like, I do think that there are arguments for qualia that are like, these are impossible, no matter how helpful they might be, you can't use them. And then there are arguments against qualia where they're just like, you know what, once you get this looking professional, it's not really doing anything that just pure representation can't do, right? So I think, delineating between those is tough sometimes, about like, hey, am I saying, oh, it would be so nice to have qualia, but it doesn't work? Or am I saying, you know what, we don't really need this qualia thing, And I think you can read different illusionists even talking in different ways about that, for sure. For me, I'm more on the you don't need it side, right? Like for me, I think the kind of strong representationalist picture that doesn't really make reference to qualia is a really good one. And I think when you try and bring qualia in, you actually lose some of what representationalism is good at. Every general view has different reasons people might find it attractive, right? And so it might be that the things that some people see as like bullet biting in representationalism, I'm like, that's what I'm here for. I think it just depends on kind of your even broader, commitments in these things. But I definitely think they're compatible, right? And there is a way to make them fit really well together.
Got it. Awesome. Right, I won't keep you any longer. But
well, thanks. I really enjoyed this. This was awesome. We should maybe try to think about some stuff we touch on here and come back for another round, because I have a lot more. I'm sure I could say. Same with you.
Yeah, I can feel stuff percolating, and I'm just sort of coming to life with it.
Yeah, so, let's do a touch base again in a little bit. I'd love to go over more of this stuff, but I really appreciate it. Great questions. I hope that was at least a good sales pitch for
yeah, for sure. I reckon if we do it again as well, let's maybe just keep it completely like organic, because I think we could just then go where we need to go and then not go where we don't need to go, kind of thing. But it was really great to meet you.
I'd love to keep working on this, man. Keep in touch, okay?
Nice. Yeah, you too. Yeah.
Have a good one, man. Bye.
Take care. Bye.